Hanneke Faber, president of Unilever's Nutrition Business Group, Mark Isbell, partner at Isbell Farms, and Sam Cass, partner at Acre Venture Partners. This discussion, Reviving the Earth, Regenerative Agriculture and a Sustainable Future, is moderated by Maggie Lake, veteran journalist and founder of Maggie Lake Media.
I think the mics are working. If not, they'll pop up in a minute. But it's great to see everyone back. So we're going to continue on, pick up right where the last panel left off. And they were discussing and ending on the issue of fertilizer and supply chains. We're going to take it right back to where it starts, talk a little bit about farming and growing. We have a fantastic panel here kind of touching every part of that, which I think is super important. Sam, I'd like to start with you. You've had your hand in every part of the food chain. You were a chef, as well as the senior White House advisor for nutrition for the Obamas, and are now on the investment side at Acre Venture Partners. What do you think the state of the global food system is? Just sort of set the table, no pun intended, for us.
The puns are unavoidable on this.
Yeah, they are. I feel that. It's actually not part of my brain.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody? Good? Good to see you guys. Look, it's a big, loaded question. Obviously, there's a lot to be proud of, right? We're feeding a lot of people, but we're also not feeding a lot of people. It's almost 1 billion people malnourished, undernourished, and about 2 billion who are overweight, obese. So we have some real challenges in the status quo, but due to climate and the shifts we're seeing, I think we're at severe risk for some pretty difficult days ahead. And many of the foods that we know and love and take for granted, like coffee, wine, chocolate, crustaceans, shellfish, nuts, are really in threat by, our kids and grandkids may not have access to those basic foods that we all know and love. And major commodities which underpin stability and security around the world are set to see pretty dramatic declines in the coming decades. And I think that puts a tremendous amount of risk on our ability to feed ourselves. And as we've seen examples of, when people don't have enough food, you see a lot of political instability, a lot of forced migration, and conflict that arises from that. And so what we do now, the actions that we take to lower the footprint of the system, it's about a third of the world's carbon emissions, 70% of the world's water goes into ag, number one driver of loss, of biodiversity loss and deforestation. We have to lower the footprint there. We have to also start to really invest in adaptation and our ability to grow food in a much more volatile climate. But for me, even in the face of pretty dire future, if you look at what the models are showing us, I think food and agriculture is the only system on Earth that has the ability to sequester enough carbon to make a difference in the global footprint in the time horizon that the science says we have to make that difference. None of these other like carbon capture, suck it out of the air technologies are going to come anywhere close to scaling in the time we need. And food and ag holds that potential. And we're seeing some examples, you'll hear today, of real models in progress that could actually start to really do that. So that gives me hope, even though the models and science are telling us that the future is quite grim unless we take much more aggressive action than we are today.
Yeah, that's the action part. But the plan part, having a plan, is important and a way forward. So, Hanneke, that sort of brings up your piece in this, because, I mean, this is a business resiliency, business threat, as well as a climate and planet threat. How are you thinking through this? And talk to me about this investment in the adaptation. When Sam said that, and Sam, we'll get more specific on what Acre's doing in this too, but how is Unilever investing in this? What way do you see forward?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said it. It's about resilience, it's about emissions. We are committed to regenerative agriculture. That is not charity. That is not a nice to have. And I think for many years, people thought, oh, this is for like the greenest companies, the most progressive. It is no longer that. If we don't change the way we farm, we're not going to have enough food. And that's already has been an issue in Africa, of course, as Agnes outlined just now, forever. But the same thing is going to be happening here in the U.S. and in Europe, and we're already seeing it. So we're going to talk about a couple of our big crops today that we're investing in, but one of them is tomatoes. Last year, the tomato harvest in Spain was down by 40% because of drought. 40% fewer tomatoes. And if, like me, you sell a lot of tomato soup and ketchup, this is a problem. So we have to change the way we farm. So that's what we're doing. We're doing that for a more resilient supply and food security. And we're doing that because there's no other way any food company can meet their lofty net zero commitments. What are we doing? We've put aside €1 billion in a climate and nature fund to support farmers, and Mark will tell you how we're working together on a crop, rice in Mark's case. We're rolling out regenerative agriculture practices. Sometimes we spend too much time on the definition of what is a regenerative agriculture and what is a practice. We're not going to do that today. What's important to us is impact. And the impacts we're definitely seeing. So we, this week, I think are the first big food company who have published results, impact results of our regenerative agriculture investments, programs that have been in the field with farmers for 3 or more years. And what we're seeing on those tomatoes in Spain, by the way, my competitors had 40% fewer tomatoes, but we didn't because we're doing regen ag, so that was good. We had enough ketchup. But we're also just published 37% fewer greenhouse gas emissions from the regenerative practices in tomatoes, and 173% increase in pollinators from simple interventions like biodiversity strips. So we love that, and then Mark's going to talk about rice, but I can tell you the methane reductions from the practices Mark is implementing are shocking. So 76% fewer methane reductions from the practices that Mark is implementing. So we are so proud and so thankful, and it's also really good and nutritious rice. So yeah. I think you'll want to hear more about that.
And I think that. Yeah, are we all can use this? Yeah, okay. We're on the hand. Is this?
Hello? Okay. It's super important that you say that, though, because in all of these discussions, the numbers matter, data matters. This is what is going to enable people to take this and say, get the financing, get the buy-in. So this measuring it is incredibly important, right? Any SDG conversation, you'll hear it. If we can measure it, we can manage it. So that's super important. Mark, so tell us what this looks like on the ground. And I feel like what used to be a distant conversation is now front and center to so many people because of the headlines. We've all experienced a shortage. We are seeing the lack of foods we're used to having everywhere now in the world. So it's not isolated. I feel like it's very much in the popular conversation. Right. So tell us what that looks like on the ground. I'm going to pass the mic to you because
I think this one's working actually. Okay, it seems like so. So this is the first I'm hearing of the potential tomato shortage actually. So I can say for my children on the ketchup front, we're grateful that you fixed that problem.
I second that.
Yeah, but I'm here to talk about rice and the program that Unilever has worked on our farm in particular. And why is rice important to the world? First of all, it's 20% of the calories in the entire world come from rice. And why is it an issue with methane? And that's because soil, at least healthy soil, which we all aspire to have, is teeming with life. It is just, they say that there's more microorganisms in a handful of soil than there are people in the world. And so some of those microorganisms, when they're wet, they create methane. When they're inundated with water in an anaerobic environment, they create methane. But when you dry them down and you let them have some air, they don't create as much methane. So when we look practically what this looks like in rice production, rice is typically grown in a completely flooded situation. But if we can periodically allow air to get to the soil throughout the year, not only can we use less water, but we can also reduce that methane, as Hanneke said, by 76%. And it's very meaningful. It saves water, it saves methane, and it's been a very beneficial thing. Now, from Unilever's perspective, what I appreciate that they have done, I've been working in this space for a lot of years at this point with different organizations. And there was initially sort of a concept that farmers should just do these things, right? And what wasn't realized is there's real risk, there's real cost involved into making these changes. And unless you have people that are willing to help you get over that hump and incentivize those things, then you can't expect someone to make that change. And so rather than companies trying to set their goals, externalize the cost of those goals down onto the farmer, which is not good for any of us, it's imperative that they do like Unilever's done here and say, hey, we're going to put some money behind this. We're going to take this seriously, and we're going to try to help find a solution to this issue. And that's an example of how we've done that this time.
I think that's hugely important because that's risk mitigation, right, at its core. I mean, you have to have a partnership like that rather than just push the burden down. And I think you maybe recognize an obstacle of what's been standing in the way. Sam, can this scale, can this be applied? How are you thinking about this from an investment point of view, especially given what Mark just said, that there is an upfront investment that's needed?
Yeah, I mean, I just need to point out like what a big deal this is. First of all, this is Unilever's entire U.S. rice footprint. So this is the entire supply chain for rice that they have. And if you would take this model that's been done and put it across the globe, about 10% of arable land in the world is farming rice. It's about 11% of the global agricultural emissions come from rice, and about 34 to 43% of water in agriculture is going to rice production. And so if you take this model and start to apply it around the globe, you're talking about cutting the overall food, which is over a third of the global emissions footprint, by 5%, just right there, just on rice. Just if we do collectively what Unilever's figured out how to do in partnership with innovative, incredible producers. It's hard to overstate what a big deal this is. And Annika, I just congratulate you on your leadership on these issues to really try to figure out how to make this work through the value chain. And I think without understanding the economics for growers and making this work for them, none of this is going to scale. And we have to think about supports, incentives, and for what we're seeing from the investment side, new tools and technologies that can dramatically improve a producer's ability to sequester carbon or reduce their emissions, so that value can start being pushed through the chain. Ultimately, we'll find new sources of either having to pay a little more or other sources of offsets from other parts of the economy to help us drive this transformation and make the numbers work. But we have a model here, unlike, quite frankly, anything I've seen in the industry, of showing how far we can go with the right interventions. And really, this is what the future needs to look like.
And let us not be naive, by the way, on, is this investment ready? This is companies leaning in and funding. So in this case, Unilever, and some of our suppliers as well, so the big traders, leaning in and paying farmers like Mark a small premium for going through this transition, because it is a risky transition. It's hard work. Yep. So as Mark said, he's not going to do it if we just say do it. But I am convinced that leaning in is worthwhile for, again, the resilience. I had the tomatoes. Some of my frenemies did not. And also because as a company, we have committed to being net zero by 2039. Oh, my God. And we don't quite know how to get there. But I certainly know if I don't massively reduce the emissions in our agricultural Scope 3 supply chain, we're never going to get there. So that investment is worthwhile. It's manageable, absolutely manageable. And I need more of our friends in the industry to come along with us, as well as then support from governments, from NGOs. And what we need from government is the policy environment that makes it last. And it's fascinating what Mark was saying in the green room on the policy environment on water and how that influences rice. So
I think this is a great, and Mark, I think you're in a perfect position to talk about this because you're a fourth generation farmer, if not, I'm not mistaken. So I'd love to hear about the willingness of farmers to make the change if they have the support, and what does the policy look like? Because none of this is in a silo. We say this over and over again, but you need intersecting policies to come together in order to create, I think, the backdrop for you to succeed. So talk to me a little bit about the desire for change and what do you need in terms of those policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And leading into that, I'd just like to contextualize it by saying, we're asking what will it take to get farmers to do that. Let's look briefly at what farmers have done over the past, say, 60 years. In the U.S., at least, we're spending 33% less of our disposable income on food than we were 60 years ago. We're feeding twice as many people in the U.S., and we're feeding 3 times as many people in the world. As Sam pointed out, there are some issues with that. We haven't met it perfectly, but there was a challenge. There was a question at some point of whether we would be able to produce enough food to feed the world, and we did. And there are repercussions to that, right? And creating this affordable food supply, there has been, it creates its own challenges too. So, I was reminded of a meme from several years ago back, and it was focused on college students, and it said, choose 2. It's so you can have a social life, you can have good grades, or, you can have plenty of sleep. Choose 2, right? So, now as a farmer, I hear people saying, okay, you can stay in business, which here at Foreign Policy, with the backdrop of we need to have a food system in the United States that is secure and able to provide food. That's the backdrop. We want our U.S. farmers to stay in business. They stay in business, provide an incredibly affordable, cheap, if you will, food supply. And, oh, by the way, please solve climate change, too. So we can work on each of those, but you've got to give just a little bit on something. And what Unilever has realized in this, and what I applaud them for, is the one that you give on is you're going to have to give just a little bit of that margin, or maybe the customer is going to have to give just a little bit more to incentivize that change. But unless you're willing to do that, I mean, let's be honest, it's farming has to be a business if we're going to stay at it, right? Absolutely. And we cannot make these changes unless companies adopt this same type of concept, that the emissions that happen on the farm associated with this food production are not my, as a farmer, emissions. They are the footprint of the consumer that has to have that. And what I'm able to do is steward the production of that food in such a way, if you will help me, and you are, if I can steward in such a way that I can help reduce the emissions of those consumers while trying to keep this triangle and some level of perspective.
Yeah, I think for both Hanneke and Sam, I think this is, again, where the data matters, right? Because if you give consumers tangible evidence that the premium they may pay, if it goes to them, is going toward real change, then you get buy-in, as opposed to broad promises. Then it's harder. And the same thing with investment money. I mean, if we're getting down to nuts and bolts, investment money will flow to where there is actual tangible progress. And especially when you start to pile on the virtuous loop you create with climate and food security, that makes a difference too. So how important is all of that piece of this?
Absolutely. So our program on regenerative agriculture is global. It goes across today 250,000 hectares, 29 countries, more than 10 different crops. So implementation is part 1 of that, but part 2 of that is measure, report, and verify. Because we're only doing this to create more resilience and to reduce emissions, reduce water, increase biodiversity, and get to net zero in a way that improves farmers' incomes, because otherwise none of it will last. So absolutely 2 critical elements. And again, we are absolutely happy to fund that transition, but we will need government to then put the policy environment in place so it lasts. So I'm very happy to see Shavonda there at the USDA. And I think actually here in the US, you guys are doing a great job in creating that policy environment and some of the research and the data. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Sam, your thoughts on?
On the data side, we're actually investing directly into platforms to provide this data for companies. One of the companies I'm most excited about is a company called Planet Forward, which does much more affordable life cycle assessments and decarbonization recommendations based on that data, on the footprints of companies' operations in Scope 1, 2, and, but most importantly, really, when you look at the data in the food and agriculture space, 90% of most companies' emissions plus are in Scope 3. And right now, the data for Scope 3 has been pretty poor. And so what you see really across the board is companies making big, bold statements, which is a great first step, but without any kind of real actionable data to understand really where the company is from a footprint perspective, and then how to measure and track progress and make decisions with a platform that could start to integrate your carbon implications of a decision into that process. And so there's a big gap about how to operationalize these goals because that data is missing. So the teams are like, okay, I hear you, CEO, but like I don't know if that almond or this pistachio, what's the implication? And so you cannot make those kind of decisions. So we've invested directly in trying to build that infrastructure. And I think if I would say one thing to do that every company should do is like, there's a couple others out there too, to pick somebody and get that embedded because the teams can start to work with that data. Without that data, and that's true both on the agricultural side, but then through the rest of the implications of your footprint, you're just not going to know how to make a decision, and you can't justify ROI on any one of those investment decisions. And so it's critical. And without better data, we're just going to see small incremental progress, but nobody creates a new way of working in terms of driving these changes forward.
Yeah, I like that you call it infrastructure. All we talk about right now is infrastructure spending, and this is another form of infrastructure, maybe one that is earlier on. It doesn't exist anymore. Some of this is building it from scratch. Mark, we'll finish up with you since you're a boots on the ground. I see you nodding as they're talking.
So the data is so important, and I think that's one reason, in addition to the farm, that I've co-founded with some others, a company called Arva Intelligence that's just focused on making sure we can ingest this data from the farm and package it in such a way that we give it to the CPG, like Unilever, and it provides the veracity and the integrity of that claim. We know it happened. We know it had this result because we have the analytics behind that. But what is also incredibly important, if you come to me as Unilever and say, I want all of this data, and maybe you're going to pay some extra for that, that's great. Maybe I do it. But what if you come to me and say, okay, we're going to take this data. We're going to use it so that we can prove that we met our Scope 3 emissions reductions. But also, I'm going to help you analyze that data and help you make decisions on the farm that not only takes what you're doing now and helps me monetize that as Unilever, but helps you make new decisions that create new environmental benefits. So we've got to take that data and look at it from both directions. Yes, we have to have the integrity behind the claim, but we also have to use that data in a way that respects the privacy of the farmer, of course, but give something back to that farmer so that they can make decisions that take them even to the next level. Yeah. And I think that's incredibly important. Yeah. And then just on your statement as far as the government goes, we've got the Climate Smart Partnerships that came out recently, and I believe Secretary Vilsack will be here later. There have been a lot of positive movements on this front, on what the government can do, what the USDA can do to help incentivize some of this. So it's an all of the above approach. Okay, farmers can make decisions. They can, with help of others, make some changes. Private enterprise, large multinational companies can make a change, and the government has a role to play too. But if we're going to solve this problem, we have to be realistic about the fact that it costs money, and that has to come from somewhere. And I'll leave it to the marketplace to decide where that comes from. But sitting on the ground, I can tell you that it takes it to make change. And we all know that. We know that in our own personal lives, so we should expect it in farming and agriculture as well.
Absolutely. But again, I believe those investments are modest in the big picture, and the payoff is huge. 76% methane reduction across all of our rice for the U.S. I mean, this is huge.
Yeah.
And I think one of the encouraging things, and we'll end on Sam's note of optimism, the challenges are huge, but what I'm hearing is that solutions are there. Yeah. The technology is only going to get better in terms of predictive modeling that will help. We just really need to supercharge that. SDG 17 exists for a reason, right? The public-private partnerships, and when you get the investment piece, the farmer, companies coming together, and government, then it sounds like there is an awful lot to be hopeful for. Thank you so much. Fantastic conversation. Thank you all.
And now please welcome to the stage Dr. Purnima Menon, the Senior Director of Food and Nutrition Policy at the International Food Policy Research Institute, Zainab Salbi, the co-founder of Daughters for Earth, and Geeta Sethi, World Bank Advisor and Global Lead for Food Systems. This panel discussion on women at the forefront of regenerative agriculture is moderated by FP's Vice President of Research for FP Analytics, Dr. Maisha Alam.